Good morning, I'm Danilo Evangelista. Welcome to our tropical weather outlook video for today, the day after July 4th, July 5th, 2024. We have a lot to go over today, including Hurricane Beryl now after it made landfall earlier this morning on the Yucatan. It is now looking increasingly likely that Beryl might be aiming for Texas, and it might do so as a hurricane potentially on approach. We're going to go over all of that. Let's start off with what is currently going on with Beryl right now by the National Hurricane Center. As of the 8 a.m. update, it is still a Category 2, although it has weakened quite a bit overnight after surprising us with it intensifying once again yesterday evening back into a major hurricane. But wind shear did somehow manage to finally get to Beryl once again overnight, and it did weaken on approach to the Yucatan, thank goodness, and it only hit, quote unquote, only as a Category 2, but winds were still definitely pretty strong. It also did slow down quite a bit. It is moving west-northwest at 15 miles per hour, and if you're tracking it, it is located at 20.4 north, and its longitude is 87.6 west. And now that we are into the Yucatan now, it is all eyes on Texas, where we're potentially looking at, once again, a hurricane landfall for them. And I'll show you the National Hurricane Center cone in just a moment, but it's looking very likely that Texas needs to watch for Beryl. Here's a satellite, though, a little bit bugged out, but still works somewhat. Beryl now over the Yucatan. Interestingly enough, you could see on the northern part, and whenever the satellite doesn't freeze over, let me see if I can actually refreeze it. But once again, shear did get to Beryl overnight. It did cause it to weaken and kind of lose its core a little bit. And it'll continue to lose its core as it's now over the Yucatan. But one of the very interesting things that obviously occurred with Beryl is that it did seem like it took a northerly jog once again overnight. And now we're potentially looking at this emerging over the northern part of the Yucatan rather than emerging over the Bay of Campeche. And this is very important because, as I mentioned over the last several days, every single little thing that Beryl does in the short term will have huge implications on what it will do in the long term. And now, since we had a bunch of these short term wobbles, especially to the north over the last day or so with Beryl, now all the models are seeing it, and they're now starting to shift the potential landfall area now into southern Texas. And it is still over the Yucatan. And once again, one of the other things we got to watch now over the next several hours is how much it remains over the Yucatan, which will obviously mean how much does it weaken before it enters the Gulf, where things look pretty favorable, if you ask me, for this potentially to at least intensify somewhat on approach to the Texas Gulf Coast, and it does look like indeed it could do so as a hurricane, as showed by the National Hurricane Center. So I'm definitely not exaggerating the potential that Beryl might have over the Gulf. They actually do explicitly forecast now, still over the Texas northern Mexico border, but I'll show you a lot of the model guidance has now shifted more towards southern Texas rather than northern Mexico within the last run or so. But they show it as a hurricane. They show it occurring overnight Monday night into early Monday morning, and obviously they do show it though in the shorter term, probably weakening back down to a tropical storm as it continues to move over the Yucatan. And there are tropical storm warnings in effect for the northern parts of the Yucatan. Probably they're going to obviously get strong winds, heavy rain associated with the storm, the usual impacts. But once again, it's really up to how much time does Beryl remain over the Yucatan, also what part of the Yucatan it emerges over, which will obviously also have an impact on how much time it remains, if it goes over more land or not. It'll all really have an impact on potentially what we're looking at in terms of where it will make landfall. And I can already tell there's a lot of Harvey comparisons to this, and I'm going to throw it out right now. The storm does indeed slow down, and I mean, it's already going to be moving slower as it's in the Gulf. It's already slowed down significantly right now, but it does slow down as well, once again, as it moves over land. But it does look like once Beryl makes landfall, it'll probably be a little bit more of a quicker paced storm rather than something that stalls out. and just dumps a lot of rain over Texas, which is what we saw with Harvey. But regardless, Texas needs to be on the lookout potentially for hurricane landfall, and obviously with that, lots of rain as well over Texas, because there will be flooding rains too with this, regardless of whether or not it becomes a hurricane. It makes it into Texas as a hurricane. Although I do want to show you though, as I mentioned yesterday, lots of the model guidance was down here closer to the Texas-Mexico border. And now as of the 12Z run for Hurricane Beryl, it definitely looks like we're honing in basically on Texas now, because the model guidance ensemble, the model envelope, still uncertain on whether or not it's going to be a Texas-Mexico border landfall or potentially a landfall into southern central Texas, as some of these models show. But it seems like all of them are now certain that this could potentially be a Texas landfall now, rather than models that were showing a northern Mexico landfall. So I do want to point out there is more certainty now that we're looking at potentially things trending more towards Texas rather than towards northern Mexico. And the other interesting part is that once this moves over the Yucatan, look at how much warm water it has ahead of this storm. This is very much, and it's right on cue with how the Gulf of Mexico usually is, but it's still above normal. And look at how widespread. These greens represent 29 degrees Celsius ahead of Beryl, and that is over the entirety, basically, of the Gulf of Mexico. We have a few spots where it's below that, especially right along the northern Yucatan coastline. But beyond that, especially as we get into the general path of which Beryl is going to take, which is roughly going to be like this, notice ahead of its path, especially through the southern central Gulf, widespread areas of 29s, and notice how near the Texas coast those temperatures increase as well and go from 29 to 30 degrees Celsius. So in terms of the component on its track and in terms of what it has oceanically ahead of Beryl, it is very favorable oceanically for Beryl to intensify quite a bit. Obviously, the minimal that we typically look at for tropical cyclone development is usually 26 degrees Celsius in sea surface temperature as well. We're definitely well beyond that, 29s, 30s. Definitely lots of energy in the atmosphere to support intensification over the Gulf. What about the upper atmospheric part, though, when it comes to Beryl? Because last night, as I mentioned, it did quickly intensify into a major, but then it de-intensified as it approaches the Yucatan. There was a lot of shear that occurred over Beryl, and usually I show the wind shear map, how it generally looks like in the upper levels of the atmosphere, but I wanted to show the shear tendency. This is basically how much has wind shear changed over the past 24 hours. And you can see over the Yucatan, the shear has increased a little bit, which is why Beryl weakened, obviously, as it approached the Yucatan. But notice in the Gulf, lots of these shear tendencies have been with these blue dots, these kind of blue lines representing shear has decreased dramatically in the Gulf of Mexico over the last 24 hours. And over the next 24 hours, it's probably going to continue to decrease as Beryl moves into the Gulf. It's associated with this upper level low, which imparted a lot of that shear over Beryl, but that's going to continue to move in over Mexico, and then eventually over the next 24 or so hours, things will probably become a lot more favorable for Beryl to ramp up, and wind shear will decrease as well a lot. And over these very warm sea surface temperatures in the Gulf, it is definitely a very concerning thing, and it is certainly a very favorable atmosphere that is setting up ahead of Beryl in the Gulf. And a lot of the models are picking up on this, and as a result, and I'm going to show you right now, I was going to show a tweet, but I'm not going to show it anymore. As a result of that, a lot of the models are now beginning to pick up on Beryl moving into the Gulf. And as it approaches the Texas coast, it does begin to ramp up quite a bit. And I'll show you here on the GFS. Has Beryl making landfall 987 millibars? Obviously, it was a lot less than that. It's much more into the upper 970s and lower 980s rather than 987. do want to point out a caveat is when you're looking at the global models like the GFS, they tend to not be good with intensity, so I wouldn't really worry about the intensity aspect of Beryl. But moving it out into time, Beryl obviously moves over the Yucatan and emerges within the next 24 hours. So roughly by the end of tonight into early tomorrow, Beryl should be back out over the Gulf of Mexico, and then it moves into the Gulf. Roughly has, I think, between the Gulf and a landfall in Texas, it has roughly around 48 or so hours before it moves into Texas. But notice it's definitely a weaker system for at least 24 hours or so while it's in the Gulf. But then notice as we start getting towards day 3, as it approaches Texas, notice it goes from, I think right here, 996 millibars at hour 60 to just less than 24 hours later. Look at that, at hour 78. This is just beyond 3 days, right on the Texas coast, 986 millibars, and that's on the GFS, so it has a 10 millibar decrease within less than 24 hours as it approaches Texas. Probably that's a hurricane on the GFS that is approaching Texas, and then obviously it moves inland afterward. Does slow down, but you could definitely see, unlike Harvey, because I know there's going to be a lot of Harvey comparisons, Beryl obviously does move in briskly over Texas, and then it moves to the northeast away and away from the Texas coast, and impacts obviously end there. But there's going to be the impacts inland as well with flash flooding and heavy rain, but you get what I mean. This is not going to be stalling over Texas like Harvey did and dumped copious amounts of rain. But the part that I find that is very similar to potentially a storm like Harvey is, notice on the GFS. See, we go from 1,001 millibars at hour 54, and then that's 12Z Sunday, and then look at where we are, 12Z on Monday, so roughly 24 hours from that, 1,001 millibars to 986 millibars approaching the Texas coast. Rapid intensification, it seems like, that the GFS shows on approach to Texas, and then it moves inland after that, but it's not the only model, which is why it has my concern too. So this is the GFS, and keep in mind, once again, the GFS does not have a good handle on intensity as well. So since we mentioned that, what about a model like the hurricane models that do have an actual handle on hurricanes such as Beryl, and actually are a lot more specialized in the intensity of hurricanes rather than the GFS, which is a global model? Let's show that. So let's see what the HWRF shows. A really reliable hurricane model had it over the Yucatan, 974 millibars. Obviously within the next 24 hours. Seems like even earlier than the GFS, although I think the GFS only moves in 24-hour increments, in 6-hour increments, while this model goes over 3. So, but still, looks like it moves over the Yucatan and back into the Gulf by later tonight into early tomorrow. As a pretty weak storm, that's probably only a tropical storm on the HWRF, but notice how quickly it ramps up. So this is hour 40, this is hour 36, 985 millibars, hour 48, 974, and then this is into hour 72 approaching the Texas coast. This is 966, and then right on the Texas coast, 962. And what is that in terms of the wind aspect? It is 86, 89 knots, so that's roughly a mid-range category 2 heading into Texas within literally 48 hours that it emerges into Texas from the Yucatan Peninsula, not into Texas, into the Gulf from the Yucatan Peninsula, and then it moves into Texas as probably a formidable Category 1, Category 2 hurricane on this model. And that's only 48 hours. And let's actually see what its intensity is once it moves over the Gulf. Only a mid-range tropical storm once it moves over the Gulf, and then it goes from that into what it seems like a pretty decent and formidable hurricane heading into the Texas coast. So we're looking at potentially rapid intensification, or at least decent intensification over the Gulf, and that should definitely keep interests along Texas and even northern Mexico, because they're still in the cone of uncertainty. We could still see this trend a little bit further south, that northern Mexico instead is the area of target rather than Texas, but lots of the models now are starting to hone in on Texas, and the conditions are looking very favorable over the Gulf. So we'll have to see. We might indeed see a hurricane landfall on Texas out of Beryl. That certainly seems like the consensus today from the models are, or at least as of this morning. But it's really going to depend on how quickly Beryl moves out over the Yucatan, and how strong it is as it moves into the Gulf. Lots to pay attention to over the next several days. And we're not done with Beryl yet. Looks like Beryl's going to have one more final destination before all is said and done and it moves out. So we have a lot more to keep on top of over the next several days. And if you want to keep on top of it with me here on my channel, I would really appreciate it if you like, comment, and especially subscribe, and turn the notification bell on as well to get my videos as soon as I upload them. Trust me, over the course of the next few days, I'll be uploading a lot. Probably going to start switching back to more video updates in one day rather than just one video like I'm doing today. Probably starting tomorrow, I'm going to do 2 updates per day, maybe even a third one if things kind of warrant that. But it's definitely looking interesting for Texas. All eyes should be on Beryl over the next several days. And regardless, there will probably be impacts no matter what for people in southern Texas. Just depends on what Beryl does and what its track is over the next 24 hours or so. It's really going to have lots of implications on how things are once it gets to Texas. With that being said, though, thanks for watching. I'm Danilo Evangelista. Stay safe, peace, love, and kindness to you all. Watch the tropics, especially if you're in the Texas Gulf Coast, and we will talk again very soon.